everyone, it's Claire again, and I'm assuming that you know I'm Claire. If not, that's sort of sad. Anyways, this is my second and final oral interpretation of the semester. The first one, I did a piece from The Country of the Pointed Firs, and this time I will be reading a selection from the... It's going to be backwards because this is a recording, but The Marrow of Tradition Aloud. If you want to follow along, it is the entirety of the chapter called The Sisters, which is the very last chapter of the book. So it starts on page 242. So feel free to follow along if you so choose. And yep, here we go. Miller's doorbell rang loudly, insistently, as though demanding a response. Absorbed in his own grief, into which he had relapsed upon Carteret's departure, the sound was an unwelcome intrusion. Surely the man could not be coming back. If it were someone else, what else might happen to the doomed town concerned to naught? His child was dead. His distracted life could not be left alone. The doorbell rang clamorously, appealingly. Through the long hall and the closed door of the room where he sat, he could hear someone knocking and a faint voice calling, "Open, for God's sake, open!" It was a woman's voice, the voice of a woman in distress. Slowly, Miller rose and went to the door, which he opened mechanically. A lady stood there, so near the image of his own wife, whom he had just left, that for a moment he was well-nigh startled. A little older, perhaps, a little fairer of complexion, but with the same form, the same features, marked by the same wild grief. She wore a loose wrapper, which clothed her like the drapery of a statue. Her long, dark hair, the counterpart of his wife's, had fallen down and hung disheveled about her shoulders. There was blood upon her knuckles, where she had beaten with them upon the door. "Dr. Miller," she panted, breathless from her flight and laying her hand upon his arm appealingly. When he shrank from the contact, she still held it there. "Dr. Miller, you will come and save my child? You know what it is to lose a child. I am so sorry about your little boy. You will come to mine." "Your sorrow comes too late, madam," he said harshly. "My child is dead. I charged your husband with his murder, and he could not deny it. Why should I save your husband's child?" "Ah, Dr. Miller," she cried, with his wife's voice. She never knew how much, in that dark hour, she owed to that resemblance. "It is my child, and I have never injured you. It is my child, Dr. Miller, my only child. I brought it into the world at the risk of my own life. I have nursed it, I have watched over it, I have prayed for it, and it now lies dying. Oh, Dr. Miller, if you have a heart, come and save my child." "Madam," he answered more gently, moved in spite of himself, "my heart is broken. My people lie dead upon the streets at the hands of yours. The work of my life is in ashes, and yonder, stretched out in death, lies my own child. God! Woman, you ask too much of human nature. Love, duty, sorrow, justice call me here. I cannot go." She rose to her full height. "Then you are a murderer," she cried wildly. "His blood be on your head, and a mother's curse beside." The next moment, with a sudden revulsion of feeling, she had thrown herself at his feet, at the feet of a Negro, this proud white woman, and was clasping his knees wildly. "Oh, God," she prayed, in tones which quivered with anguish, "pardon my husband's sins and my own, and move this man's hard heart by the blood of thy Son, who died to save us all." It was the last appeal of poor humanity. When the pride of his intellect and caste is broken, when we grovel in the dust of humiliation, when sickness and sorrow come, and the shadow of death falls upon us, and there is no hope elsewhere, we turn to God, who sometimes swallows the insult and answers the appeal. Miller raised the lady to her feet. He had been deeply moved, but he had been more deeply injured. This is his wife's sister. Ah, yes, but a sister who had scorned and slighted and ignored the existence of his wife for all her life. Only Miller, of all the world, could have guessed what this had meant to Janet, and he had merely divined it through the clairvoyant sympathy of love. This woman could have no claim upon him because of this unacknowledged relationship. Yet, after all, she was his wife's sister, his child's kinswoman. She was a fellow creature, too, and in distress. "Rise, madam," he said with a sudden inspiration, lifting her gently. I will listen to you on one condition. My child lies dead in the adjoining room, his mother by his side. Go in there and make your request of her. I will abide by her decision." The two women stood confronting each other across the body of the dead child, mute witness of this first meeting between two children of the same father. Standing thus face to face, each under the stress of the deepest emotions, the resemblance between them was even more striking than it had seemed to Miller when he had admitted Mr. Carteret into the house. But death, the great leveler, striking upon the one hand and threatening upon the other, had wrought a marvelous transformation in the bearing of the two women. The sad-eyed Janet towered erect, with menacing aspect, like an avenging goddess. The other, whose pride had been her life, stood in the attitude of a trembling suppliant. "You have come here," cried Janet, pointing with a tragic gesture to the dead child. "You, to gloat over your husband's work. All my life you have hated and scorned and despised me. Your presence here insults me and my dead. What are you doing here?" "Mrs. Miller," returned Mrs. Carteret tremulously, dazed for a moment by this outburst, and clasping her hands with an imploring gesture. "My child, my only child, is dying, and your husband alone can save his life. Ah, let me have my child," she moaned, heartrendingly. "It is my only one, my sweet child, my ewe lamb." "This was my only child," replied the mother, "and yours is no better to die than mine." "You are young," said Mrs. Carteret, "and may have yet many children. This is my only hope. If you have a human heart, tell your husband to come with me. He leaves it to you. He will do as you command." "Ah," cried Janet, "I have a human heart, and therefore I will not let him go. My child is dead. Oh God, my child, my child!" She threw herself down by the bedside, sobbing hysterically. The other woman knelt beside her and put her arm about her neck. For a moment, Janet, absorbed in grief, did not repulse her. "Listen," pleaded Mrs. Carteret. "You will not let my baby die. You are my sister. The child is your own near kin." "My child was nearer," returned Janet, rising again to her feet and shaking off the other woman's arm. "He was my son, and I have seen him die. I have been your sister for 25 years, and you have only now, for the first time, called me so." "Listen, sister," returned Mrs. Carteret. Was there no way to move this woman? Her child lay dying, if he were not dead already. She would tell everything and leave the rest to God. If it would save her child, she would shrink at no sacrifice. Whether the truth would still further incense Janet or move her to mercy, she could not tell. She would leave the issue to God. "Listen, sister," she said. "I have a confession to make. You are my lawful sister. My father was married to your mother. You were entitled to his name and to half his estate." Janet's eyes flashed with bitter scorn. "And you have robbed me all these years, and now you tell me that is a reason why I should forgive the murder of my child?" "No, no," cried the other wildly, fearing the worst. "I have known of it only a few weeks, since my Aunt Polly's death. I had not meant to rob you. I had meant to make restitution. Sister, for our father's sake, who did you no wrong, give me my child's life." Janet's eyes slowly filled with tears, bitter tears, burning tears. For a moment, even her grief at her child's loss dropped to second place in her thoughts. This, then, was the recognition for which, all her life, she had longed in secret. It had come after many days, and in larger measure than she had dreamed, but it had come, not with frank kindliness and sisterly love, but in a storm of blood and tears, not freely given, from an open heart, but extorted from a reluctant conscience by the agony of a mother's fears. Janet had obtained her heart's desire, and now it was at her lips, found it but apples of Sodom, filled with dust and ashes. "Listen," she cried, dashing her tears aside. "I have but one word for you, one last word, and then I hope to never see your face again. My mother died of want, and I was brought up by the hand of charity. Now when I have married a man who can supply my needs, you offer me back the money which you and your friends have robbed me of. You imagine that the shame of being a Negro swallowed up every other ignominy, and in your eyes I am a Negro, though I am your sister and you are white, and people have taken me for you on the streets, and you, therefore, left me nameless all my life. Now, what an honest man has given me a name of which I can be proud, when you offer me the one which you robbed me, and which I can make no use. For 25 years I, poor despicable fool, would have kissed your feet for a word, a nod, a smile. Now when this tardy recognition comes, for which I have waited so long, it is tainted with fraud and crime and blood, and I must pay for it with my child's life. "And I must forfeit that of mine, it seems, worth holding it for so long," sobbed the other, as tottering she turned to go. "It is but just." "Stay, do not go yet," commanded Janet imperiously, her pride still keeping back her tears. "I have not done. I throw you back your father's name, your father's wealth, your sisterly recognition. I want none of them. They are bought too dear. Ah, God, they are bought too dear. But that you may know that a woman who may be foully wronged, and yet may have a heart to feel, even for one who has injured her, you may have your child's life, if my husband can save it. Will," she said, throwing open the door into the next room, "go with her." "God bless you, a noble woman," exclaimed Mrs. Carteret. "You do not mean all the cruel things you have said. Ah, no, I will see you again, and make you take them back. I cannot thank you now. Oh, doctor, let us go. I pray God that we may not be too late." So, I realize the reading went on quite a bit longer than the generally accepted 5 minutes, but I really do think it was such an important part of this text that I did need to read the chapter in its entirety in order to get across the final message of the story fully. So now that you've heard me read aloud, I will begin my analysis of the section. So the first thing I'd like to address is the role reversal that's evident in this chapter. For much of the book, it's obviously been the white people who were in charge, and they were in the higher positions of power. They were racist and terrible, but they were the ones who were rewarded more often than not and had freedoms that Dr. Miller, for example, did not. But that takes a very sudden left turn in this chapter, which is evident from the very beginning. Mrs. Carteret goes to the Miller's household, and Dr. Miller opens the door, and she says, "Dr. Miller, you will come and save my child? You know what it is to lose a child. You will come to mine." And those aren't questions. She's commanding him to come help her son, who I believe is dying of croup. And that's very in character for Mrs. Carteret, because she is used to getting her own way, and so she just naturally assumes, and it probably also has a lot to do with her state of panic, that she doesn't have to ask. It's just going to happen. And unexpectedly, Dr. Miller does not respond in a way that I think the audience would expect. He refuses her. And this is interesting because this isn't an ordinary refusal. This isn't Mrs. Carteret asking him to, I don't know, paint her house, and Dr. Miller saying, "No, I don't think I'm going to do that." The life of Mrs. Carteret's child hangs in the balance, and this forces her to beg him to come and save her child. She literally gets down on her knees and begs him. The Chestnut clearly says, the next moment, with a sudden revulsion of feeling, she had thrown herself at his feet, at the feet of a Negro, this proud white woman, and was clasping his knees wildly. It's significant, I think, that he included this proud white woman, because it lets the reader know just how big of a deal this is, that Mrs. Carteret is doing this. And that's the beginning of the role reversal, but it's something that continues throughout the rest of the chapter, because Dr. Miller does relent to a certain degree. He says he will come to Mrs. Carteret's house, but she first has to talk to his wife. She has to talk to Janet. And this is where the chapter gets very interesting, because Janet is the one in this entire conversation. She is the one who's in charge. She's leading it where she wants it to go. And she refuses Mrs. Carteret's advances, she refuses her apologies, she refuses her excuses, she refuses everything. This conversation is owned by Janet, which is completely different from the way the rest of this book has gone. In fact, I am of the opinion that Janet was maybe not always planning on allowing her husband to go, but I think that idea came up towards the middle of the confrontation, but she just decided to prolong it in order to make a certain point and to instill a healthy dose of fear and shame and anger and indignation into Mrs. Carteret, because those are emotions she's not really familiar with, because she doesn't know what it's like to have to beg for something because she's white. All right, next I'd like to discuss the fact that Janet's discovery that Mrs. Carteret is her sister usurps her grief as the most important thing on her mind, because that's just a very small part of this chapter, but I think it's very significant nonetheless. It was interesting to me because the reason why Janet is grieving is because she's just lost her child. Like, it was recent. It was within a few hours. And losing your child is probably one of the most awful things a woman could ever go through. Or a father, for that matter. But it isn't on her mind briefly. It isn't the first thing on her mind when she finds out that Mrs. Carteret is her sister, which is understandable. It's a new discovery, but it erases some of the grief and replaces it with like a righteous sort of anger. And I think that's very interesting. And I think it is Chestnut's way of commenting on racial relations during this period of American history. The fact that this discovery is just so infuriating to Janet that it replaces even the grief at the loss of her son is just astounding to me. I wonder if it's because Chestnut was trying to let the audience know that the racial tensions during this period were so high that they replaced anything, regardless of its importance. And that I'm trying to think of the best way to put this. That Janet and Mrs. Carteret, their interaction automatically becomes that much more higher stakes when they make that discovery. And I think that was just Chestnut's way of commenting on racial tensions of that period. The third thing I'd like to examine is the fact that Dr. Miller does go and see to the baby. And I was wondering while I read it, because Chestnut very easily could have written it the other way, because this is a work of realism, and so it wouldn't have been out of place for the baby to have died, and it would have been very sad, but it would have been not common, but at least more normal in a work of this sort. And so I examined it from a racial point of view and what that ending says about Chestnut's attitudes towards racism. And I think it pointed towards him having a bit of a hopeful outlook for the world as a whole and the South, because Dr. Miller puts aside, Dr. Miller and Janet both, because it is Janet who gives the final decision, Janet puts aside her anger at discovering she's always been Mrs. Carteret's sister and never got that recognition. And Dr. Miller puts aside his anger at the white mob of men, the mob of white men, and Carteret murdering his child. And they go see to this baby, and in that moment, racial tensions are abandoned for something. Sorry, there's a plane outside my window. Sorry, my apologies. For a greater good of sorts. And I think that points towards Chestnut having a hopeful outlook on the future interactions between African Americans and white people. I hold out hope too, because racial tensions are still very evident even in 2013. But I liked that Chestnut ended it on that note and that it didn't end with a death. I suppose it could go either way. I think he left it deliberately ambiguous, and I'm sure there's some people who are going to be watching this and they're going to be thinking, no, that baby died. But I think Dr. Miller did manage to save the baby, and I think that I read it as Dodie is going to grow up to be a symbol of a renewed outlook on life and a more positive white figure, as opposed to the racist, bigoted people that we saw in this book, and that maybe he will encourage more peaceful interactions between people, and he'll look at African Americans without contempt or racism, and ideally the interactions between those two groups of people will improve as he grows. The final thing I'd like to address is whether or not this is a work of realism. I believe it is a work of realism. Just going down the checklist that we made earlier in the semester of Elements Common works of realism, there is a definite impulsiveness of, I want it now. You can see that in all of the white characters. That's the basis of a mob. It's that high level of intense emotion of people who all want the same thing. They want it so badly that it's dangerous, and it's so much excitement and fury that's how mobs get started. There is definitely pain and loss. Plenty of people die. Aunt Polly dies. The baby is sick. Dr. Miller and Janet Miller's son dies, and so the pain and loss is clearly in there. As far as a lack of a conventional happy ending goes, I don't think this one applies here because I read the ending as happier, but I suppose if you read it as the baby Dodie dies, you could look at it as lacking a conventional happy ending. An unconventional representation of women, I think that's really only evident in Janet, and only towards the very end of the text. All the other women, I think, behave the way that was expected of them for that time period. There's a definitely colloquial language, intensely colloquial language, to the point that it was hard to read it aloud. Chestnut very much wrote it in the colloquial dialect of North Carolina of this time period. It does portray working class characters. All of the African American characters, with the exception of Dr. Miller and a few others, are of the working class. It is social commentary, definitely, on racism during this period and racial relations. And it does exist to inform about racism. So it has many, many, many of the features of American realism. I'm sure there are others that I just can't think of off the top of my head. But yes, I believe it is absolutely a work of American realism. And that concludes my second oral interpretation. I hope it was entertaining / informative, and if not, sorry. I did my best, and I hope you enjoy it, and if this is what you're writing your final on, I don't even know what the final is, but if this ends up being what you write your final on, I hope my oral interpretation will help you out. So, au revoir for now. Bye. Sorry, I don't want to